Hi. So I'm Hari Prasad, and I'm here with Michael. It's great to be with you, Michael.
Great to be with you, Hari.
And I'm really looking forward to this discussion on the piece you wrote, I Dislike in You What You Dislike in Me. It's a very important understanding that you're offering us, and the title speaks volumes. This is something which I actually first encountered as a principle when I was a monk very early on. And I was quite taken aback that there are ways in which I'm seeing things that I don't like in other people, but it's really a reflection on myself. And that principle is really key, and it comes up in different ways. So let's get into it. What was the inspiration for writing this piece?
Thank you, Hari. So I had a experience last summer where I was back in New York spending some time with my parents. And one afternoon, I decided to go to the local community center gym, which was the same gym that I had frequented many times when I was in high school and whenever I would come back home during my college days as well. So this was a gym that I spent a lot of my late childhood at. And when I went to the gym this time, it was maybe 3 or 4 o'clock on a weekday afternoon. There was a lot of high school kids who were there, a lot of high school boys who were there, and they were all wearing very sexy shirts, cut off shirts. And they all had these muscles that were maybe a little bit too big for what I expected for high school kids. And it was very crowded. So I already was experiencing a little bit of irritation when I entered the gym. And I started to observe what was happening. And my observation was that these kids were all engaging in the same thing. They would do some sort of exercise set, maybe a bench press or a bicep curl or something like that. And then they would walk up to the mirror and just kind of check themselves out in the mirror. So they would flex their tricep. And if you're listening to this on audio, I'm flexing my tricep right now, or they would touch their chest. They might even lift up their shirt and check out their abs and their six pack, and maybe turn to the side profile and check themselves out from the side. And as I was watching this all unfold before me, I started to get really irritated. I was starting to experience intense judgment towards all of the boys. And in my head, I was thinking, like, what has TikTok done to all these kids? They're so obsessed with body image and how they look. And it's all about going to the gym and aesthetics. And nobody's actually in here because they care anything about actual exercise. It's all about having more status and trying to get the girls and all of those things. And I was like starting to feel bad for the boys. Like, these guys are so pathetic. What are they doing to themselves? And so it was a pretty intense thought process. And my workout went on. Eventually the boys cleared out and I got a little bit more space to do my own workout and also to think. And I was thinking, why was this such an intense experience for me? And just as I was thinking that, I caught myself checking myself out in the mirror. I did it in a much more covert way, let's say, than going up to the mirror and touching myself. But I was still doing the same thing. And I had this realization that, wow, I am not any different than those boys. I certainly wasn't different than those boys when I was back in high school. And now that I'm much older, I'm still not all that different. I might do it in a different way, but I still have those same things around body image and seeing myself through the eyes of other people as they look at my body, and some of the shame that comes from not feeling like my body is nice enough, and that obsession. And it was just a very humbling experience of, wow, all of that judgment that I was feeling about the boys was really judgment that was directed at myself and my own shame around my body and this obsession about some of these things related to the body.
It's very powerful. Thank you for taking us into that story and your thought process, which is really the underpinning. Um, and you see how it exemplifies this principle that I'm disliking something outside of me, but it's really pointing to something in me. And it's interesting because you hear this maxim, right? That when you point your finger at somebody else, you got three fingers pointing back at you.
Yeah, the dislike is the coping mechanism here. It's really the way of distancing myself from what I don't like about myself. And it's a way that I can block myself from seeing those things about myself and prevent myself from feeling the discomfort or the pain from knowing that to be true about myself. And so it prevents us from seeing the reality and prevents us from growing in a way that we would want to grow.
Yeah. And how does that impact you?
In many ways. How does the judgment impact me?
Yeah. How does the judgment impact you? Um, we'll start with that.
So, first of all, when we are experiencing judgment, we are disconnected from the other person because we're seeing them through the eyes of that judgment, and we're not seeing them as a human being on the other side going through their own struggles and having their own journey and experiencing their own insecurities and feeling compassion for those things. So the first thing it does is that it disconnects us from any sort of compassion and camaraderie and feeling of connection with other people. It also drastically changes how we're able to treat those people. Secondly, it also disconnects us from ourselves. So much of judgment is about making ourselves feel superior to somebody else, even if that's not our motivation or conscious motivation. When we judge somebody else, we're essentially knocking them down, even if we're not letting them know about our judgments. We're still in our mind knocking them down. And the reason we do that is so that we can feel superior or better or higher than somebody else. And and that's not the reality. We're straying from the best version of ourselves, where we see each other as equals and we exude qualities like humility and gratitude. It basically cuts us off from any sort of possibility of feeling those things when we're putting ourselves above other people.
Yeah, it's coming from the ego. The ego is running the show that I have to be in control. I have to be happier, better than others, and to see myself as superior in whatever sphere it is. It's sometimes it's more subtle, and it's not always like a direct sense of competition. I think in your example of the gym, there's maybe more overtness about it, but it doesn't always have to be that way. Like we talk about with the Enneagram, there are some personalities that feel like, hey, I'm just more peaceful than you. I'm just more peaceful. And, or I'm more affectionate, or I'm a better friend. So this can come out in so many different ways, but it's all the ego. And it robs us of being ourselves. So that's the tragedy.
Yeah, and it's crazy if if we're really honest with ourselves, do we actually want to become less judgmental? I mean, it's a tricky question, and maybe there's not an obvious answer on first glance, because some of us would like to become less judgmental, but the judgment gives us something. Mm-hmm. It gives us that feeling that we are not the negative behavior that we observe. And so it allows us to walk around of like, I'm a pretty good person. I would never be as loud as those people that I'm seeing over there, or I would never be as unhealthy as that person is over there who's eating that disgusting piece of food, or I would never go up to the mirror and check myself out with my abs and all of that. So it allows us to kind of walk around with our head held high, thinking of ourselves as a good person or a healthy person or whatever the specific activity or trait that we're looking at might be.
Yeah, yeah, we all want to feel good about ourselves, and we're all threatened by other people being good or feeling good about themselves or looking good in some way. And it shows the fragility of our egos, that when someone else is doing well in some way, we're threatened. And so we feel really good when we see something is not going well. And this is envy. I mean, this is the core wound of our conditioned selves. It's this envy. And Kierkegaard talks about it as the need to level, a leveling where people are on different planes, and I'm always feeling some anxiety or insecurity that I'm not stacking up. So I'll just pull them down in my mind. And I use judgment to do that. Like, oh, they're not so great. I dismiss, I make them equal to me or below me. I level them so that I can prop myself up and feel better about myself. And this looks like it's a kind of superiority, but it's actually an inferiority. As every superiority complex is, it's actually coming from a sense of inferiority.
Yeah, you've shared that before, and it's something I always keep in my mind whenever this is creeping in, whenever a superiority complex is creeping in, whether it's through judgment or through some other mechanism. It's such a helpful thought to be like, where am I actually feeling not enough? Where is my inferiority complex coming here? And trying to have a harder look at that.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. So when you had this discovery at the gym, what did you do? What did you do next?
I felt humiliated. I felt humiliated, but it wasn't just like this, oh yeah, this is how it is, and I can accept that. There was still a lot of ego stuff of trying to reject what I was seeing. There was still, well, I'm not that bad. I'm not that obvious at the, there's some, I'm classier than those guys. So there was still some distance that my ego was trying to create between me and the behavior that I was observing. But I also felt like, well, this is really rich. And it's not that this is a new discovery. It's not that nobody else has ever thought of something like this. But it did cause me to start looking at other areas of my life where this kind of, I would call it hypocrisy, might be showing up. And that's really what it is a hypocrisy, because we're judging other people for something that might also be true about ourselves. And so one of the areas that I started to look at was materialism, because I like to think of myself as a pretty non-materialistic person. In the piece, I name the ego identity of a zenned out minimalist. It's an identity I like to hold for myself. I read lots of minimalist books and subscribe to that philosophy in many ways in my life. And I grew up with a mother and a sister who liked to shop quite a bit. And I also have a partner who doesn't mind using the credit card every once in a while. And I'll notice that whenever I'm around them or other people and I see them engaging in shopping behavior or other activities that might look materialistic in some way, I'll feel a discomfort, and there'll be some judgment towards what they're doing. And that either consciously or unconsciously creates some sort of relationship dynamic that is not always the healthiest, and also creates probably discomfort on their side when they're feeling that feeling from me that I'm not appreciating their activities and what they're doing. But then I'll also notice that on Amazon Prime Day, I'm like, I'm on there even if I don't need anything. And it might be the case that a couple of Amazon boxes will arrive at our house the next day after I have this experience of judging them, and just starting to see, like, where are the places in my own life where this hypocrisy exists, and how might I start to clean that up in some way.
So much appreciate your deep level of introspection and honesty. It's a really incredible example. It's a very incredible example, you said. Yeah, and wanting to bridge the gap between how we project ourselves and how we are is so critical. I mean, that is integrity. I once heard actually a talk given, and the speaker was a spiritualist who was saying that until we really get to a very advanced level of identifying with the real self and removing the ego, in other words, being true to who we are, there's always duplicity. That's just like the momentum is so strong that we're always being duplicitous in some way. Or as you mentioned, there's always some hypocrisy. So we have to become eager to see that and root it out, because that's what really gives teeth to our journey of personal advancement, certainly spiritual advancement, or just like living with high integrity, which we take too cheaply and we think is an easy thing, but it's not.
Totally. I really appreciate that point. The self-trust is so critical because, I mean, of course, we want to be trustworthy so that other people can benefit from that, and so that they can trust us, and so that they like us, and that so they're comfortable being in relationship with us. But it's also deeper than that, because when we ourselves can't trust ourselves, which is, I think, so many of our experiences, and it just comes from little things like this of hypocritical actions, or feeling a certain way but then showing up in a different way, or being in different situations and showing up in different ways in order to get whatever it is that we're wanting. And over time, the trust for ourselves starts to erode. And even if we're projecting confidence, deep down we're losing confidence in ourselves, and this has a huge effect on our life. And I think this area, this framework of I dislike in me what I dislike in you, is a way to catch ourselves eroding trust in ourselves, and is a path to build back up that trust.
It's fantastic. So well said and important. And it doesn't only impact us, but it impacts everybody around us, because we are not living with the confidence, the motivation, the trustworthiness, the thoughtfulness, and ability to be connected with myself and connect really with other people when we're living with these gaps in self-trust and these gaps in trustworthiness. I mean, how my relationships are built on trust, as we talk about in Upbuild. Trust is the number one thing that makes or breaks a relationship. And so if I'm not trustworthy because there are all these gaps, and I'm asking people to be in relationship with me and to trust me thereby, what am I doing? I've got it all mixed up. And we see the divorce rates are so high. Colleagues are, I mean, teams have such a hard time being aligned with each other, coworkers. It's all over the place. I mean, you just see it when you open up the news, when you see countries unable to be aligned within and then with each other. It's just, this is so big, but it starts with the individual. How would we expect world peace and countries to get along when each individual that makes up those larger bodies is filled with these gaps and this lack of trustworthiness. So this is a big deal, what you're bringing out.
Yeah, and it's also a big deal because we think we can get away with it. We think it's not a big deal, which is why it really becomes a big deal as this stuff exists over long periods of time in our life.
Totally. So what are other examples where you're seeing this? And hopefully for our listeners, it sparks some thoughtfulness for them and some ability to really get more in touch with this hard truth that's it may be a tough pill to swallow, but it's so necessary. It's so healing to actually bridge the gap and become more trustworthy to ourselves and to others. So what are some other examples that can make this more concrete?
Yeah, so there are lots of other examples, that some of which are obvious, where it's like I really do that behavior, and so it's a direct yes. I dislike in me what I dislike in you. For example, the gym example that I just provided. But then there's also other examples where my behavior might not be the same as the other person, but if we look a little bit deeper, it's still this framework still holds. So, for example, lateness is something that I often feel quite judgmental about. I'm somebody who prides myself on being on time.
I love that about you, by the way. That's one of the things that I've had in my heart as feedback for you. I love it.
and I love that about you. I think you and I can depend on one another for that.
That makes me happy.
Not that our other team members are so bad with that, but I think you and I are a step above in that category.
We should quickly level them right here, right now.
Yeah, well, they'll get the message when they listen to this. So when people are late, I find it quite irritating, and there can be some judgment about the other person. And on first glance, it might seem like, well, this is not an example of this framework that we're talking about, because I dislike in others something that's different from myself. But if I look underneath that a little bit more, like, why do I judge other people who are late? Well, one of the things that comes to mind is my ego feels disrespected when other people are late. Like, they don't value my time, or whatever they're doing is more important. And it can send me down the spiral of like, oh, this person doesn't respect me. They have so many things that are better than what I'm doing, or they don't really care about the schedule that we set, or did they not listen when we were making that agreement? And it can just spiral into this judgment. And what I realized as I think about something like lateness is I can also disrespect other people in different ways. So not by showing up late, but in a conversation, my attention might be a little bit scattered. I might check my phone when I'm with someone. And there's all sorts of other subtle ways where I show a mild amount of disrespect for other people. And I know that about myself. And I don't like that about myself. But even as I'm trying to work on myself and grow personally, emotionally, spiritually, it's something that still comes up in a lot of my relationships, where I'm not giving people full attention and therefore feel like I'm not respecting them. And so I think, and it's not 100%, this framework is not 100% foolproof and work in every single example. But I think some of my dislike of people who are late is because it also reminds me of how I tend to disrespect other people in subtle ways. And I don't like that about myself. But again, it becomes this superiority complex that's really masking an inferiority complex.
I really appreciate that. So this is not meant to be one for one, apples to apples. I dislike in you what you, I dislike in you what I dislike in me is not always about matching it with the exact thing. It's about the principle itself, that there's something that's reminding me, and maybe it's not the action, but it's what the action means to me. Like you gave the very helpful example of lateness and a disrespect, and feeling like, actually, I don't like that I'm disrespectful towards other people in that way. Maybe I'm also disrespectful of their time, but not by showing up late, or I don't value their time in a certain way. I think my time is more important. It's a possibility. I know I wrestle with that myself and try to humble myself. Hey, my time is valuable, but that doesn't mean it's more valuable than somebody else's. So it's not apples to apples. It's not meant to be literal. And yes, it doesn't apply, as you said. This is also critical. It doesn't apply in all circumstances. It's not that every time you dislike something in somebody else, it means it's because you're disliking something in yourself. The idea here, and what I really got from your piece, which I think is invaluable, is checks and balances. Like, let me introspect, let me explore, let me ground myself and see what's going on. And there's a good possibility, especially if I haven't yet done a ton of work on myself, that this may be true, that I'm finding something, I'm getting triggered because you're bringing out something in me that I don't like about myself. And when I was living as a monk and I first experienced this, and again, it was a big surprise to me, I was humiliated also. I was like, wait a minute, you're saying that that thing that annoys me about my sister, that there may be a reason I'm annoyed because I do something like that also? That's the last thing I want to hear. And I had to do a lot of introspection to reconcile myself with this. And I really kept it with me that this is so important. Every time, let me check myself. If I'm feeling judgmental, let me check myself. These checks and balances are guardrails to keep moving forward on the path.
Beautiful. Yeah. The thing that you shared about the meaning that we make of it resonated a lot. It's like we tell ourselves a story about what it means when we see a behavior. And then that can be the key to finding some gold here as we're looking into what we might need to see about ourselves or become more honest about with regard to ourselves.
And that's just a great tool to keep making personal progress. If I'm always introspecting and asking myself, hey, what could I learn? What could I grow from here? You're just upping the ante on your own personal growth. So you can't really lose. It's only if you become, if you're force fitting the framework, or you become someone who condemns yourself. Instead of condemning other people, you just condemn yourself, which is usually why we condemn other people, as your piece brings out. It's because my inner critic is condemning me. I'm condemning myself. So as long as we're not using this in a heavy-handed way, I see no harm. There's only growth that can come from this. Let me ask you this question. When your judgment is objectively true, when it's grounded in as much reality as possible, what do we do then?
So you had shared when you were editing the piece the example of, I think this was it. If somebody is physically violent,
yeah,
but I'm not physically violent, does this framework still hold? And I think no, it doesn't necessarily need to hold. It still might, because if I'm someone who experiences rage every once in a while, I recognize that if I just let myself go a little bit, I could actually get there. I could actually get to a place of physical violence. Now, this, again, it won't be true for everyone, so maybe it doesn't apply. But it's still worth, even if it feels really distant, it's still worth doing that sanity check to see, like, is there anything for me to learn about the judgment from what I see here? But if we get through that and actually, like, this is not something that affects me at all, and based on my observation and what I know to be right, and my moral compass and all of those things, like, this is a really wrong behavior, just going through this process can still bring a little bit of humility and potentially offer us a way to have compassion for the other person. So while we might not be able to relate to it ourselves, we can start to ask ourselves the question, like, how might it make sense for this person to be doing what they're doing? Even if it's objectively wrong, there's something in their life that led them to this point, or there's some pain. We often quote, I forget the speaker of the quote, hurt people hurt people, or maybe that's a quote that a lot of people use that hasn't been attributed to one person. But yeah, there's a quote, hurt people hurt people.
Right.
And when we really take that in and understand that there's some reason that this person is engaging in this behavior, and it doesn't mean that it's right, and it doesn't mean that we like it, but it allows us to see, well, what's going on here, and why might it make sense from their perspective to have gone down this route. And it can give us a little bit more compassion, a little bit more understanding. And also, if we're able to, and if its situation is appropriate for this, it can allow us to help them in a much better way than if we're coming from a place of pure judgment.
Yeah, definitely. And I think when we're talking about trauma, it's probably not the point where we want to employ this framework. That may be something which we have to give ourselves the space for, and not, I mean, you can always introspect. It's always a good thing. But thinking about what I don't like in myself when I've experienced something traumatic, usually it takes time to get to that point. If there's a lesson to learn, and there may very well be a lesson to learn, even in trauma, but supporting ourselves to get to that point is critical. So you also talked about family and getting together with family as something which is triggering, and you're noticing things that apply from this framework. What is it about being with family that's triggering, and how does that relate?
Yeah, Ram Dass has a great quote. If you think you're enlightened, go and spend a week with your family. And I think no matter how much we love or how much we like our families, anyone who spent an extended period of time with their family, especially as adults, will likely feel triggered in some way. And the underlying cause of that can be part of what we're looking at with this framework of, like, our family is where we learned our stuff. We have the same genes as our family. We got a lot of who we are from them, through our genetic material, and also through observing and the learned behaviors. And so when we see our family doing things that have typically bothered us, there's very, very likely a thread, or more than a thread, of that same sort of tendency in ourselves. So if there's intensity about one of our parents that is hard for us to be okay with, it might be the case that I'm also very intense in certain ways in my life. And maybe it's not with my family, but in other ways. And I can have this feeling like, oh, I probably got that behavior from this person. And so there can be some disdain or dislike of watching that, and even some disconnection from my family, because I'm feeling really ashamed of that behavior. And I see, well, that, first of all, that person exemplifies it in a big way. And second of all, they're the reason. And so there can be this feeling of blame of, this is where I got it from.
Very clear. So when we're seeing something that's rubbing us the wrong way in another person, is it the answer to remove myself from the situation and see how I'm actually, the fact that I'm being triggered means there's a trigger in me. There was something in me, that's clear. There was something in me that brought out a reaction. It was there before the trigger point. So that part is clear. But is it always the answer to remove myself and sort of take this experience upon myself and leave the other person to be sort of fine as they are?
I think it's situation dependent. And no, we don't necessarily want to leave the person. First of all, we can do this work real time, especially if we've done it before and we understand what's going on in our relationship dynamics. Then we really don't need to leave the situation, but we can. You're going to say?
Sorry, let me clarify. I don't mean literally leave the person. I mean like leave the scene and take it upon myself that I have some fault here and sort of vindicate the other person. Or do we ever go back and say, hey, this was not good, what you did?
I think we can. And that doing that carries a lot more power if we've done the work.
Yes.
Because then we know what's really going on. We're coming from a place of authenticity and truth. And so then when we're able to deliver our message about something being right or wrong, maybe we take responsibility of like, hey, I have this in myself as well, so I get it. And it still wasn't right. And now the other person doesn't feel any sort of hypocrisy. It's much easier for them to take it in, and whether or not they take it in, and that's up to them. But at least we ourselves know that we're coming from an honest place.
This reminds me of two things. That's a great point. So one, in some of our work, including a coaching workshop that we run, a container for coaching, I often tell this story about Gandhi, who he apparently there was a little girl who was eating sweets, and it's not good for her. She was indulging. The mother really wanted her to kick the habit, and so she met Gandhi, and she said, "Can you? I've tried everything. Can you? You're a very respectable gentleman. Can you please help me to get my daughter to stop eating these junk food sweets?" And so Gandhi said, "Give me a week. I'll be right back." In a week. And so then he came back and he said, "Stop eating sweets," to the girl. And the girl stopped eating sweets. And the mother was dumbfounded, was very grateful to Gandhi, and asked the question, "Why didn't you just do this in the first place? What was the week about?" He said, "I needed to stop eating sweets." So this shows, where these gaps are. They're impacting so much. We can't even imagine the power of not having these gaps. It's unfathomable. When we meet somebody who's so pure and who has such conviction based on personal realization and the way that they live, there is nothing more powerful. That's what changed my entire life. When I met Radhanath Swami, the monk who came to my New York university and spoke, I saw this person is so aligned with himself. There are no gaps. And I was trying to find gaps. I was desperately trying to find gaps. And I was following him around, attending talks. I even went to Washington, D.C. with a bunch of monks that I didn't know. And it was like, I really was confronted by the fact that he was so pure and what he was saying was so powerful. I was afraid it was going to turn my life around. So I wanted to find the gaps so that I could dismiss and leave it behind, level him, and go back to my normal life. But I couldn't. And so look at what's become of me. I became a monk myself. And now, Upbuild began in the monastery from this journey that we've been on, all because of someone like Radhanath Swami. And then my guru, Satchidananda Swami, who we've had it Upbuild on multiple occasions. There's just nothing more powerful than closing all these gaps. And it's amazing because we're selling ourselves short. We don't realize what we're missing. What if we were unafraid to look at these things? To your point that you mentioned, a very dear mentor, Ravindra Saruprabhu, he would say that when he was finding the faults in other people because it was his duty to do so, he had responsibility to clean up certain societal dysfunction amongst spiritual practitioners. And that's a great service to do. But he said the only way that he could do it was by really, really working on himself, trying to become as pure as possible so that it comes from a pure place. It's not hypocritical, and it's not trying to level or prop myself up, and it's not trying to put people down. It's not going and saying, hey, you're wrong. But it is recognizing that behavior may need to be addressed, and it may even need to be addressed strongly. So it's not that this is out of bounds to bring attention to behavior that's not constructive. It's not that there is no right or wrong, or there is no place for addressing right or wrong. But how we do so is so critical. And if we want to be really effective, and if we want to grow and help the other person grow, or at least just spare ourselves from being written off immediately, or from like knowing or not knowing, I should say, that we've tried our best, that we've done everything in our power, we have to turn the mirror on us. We don't really have an alternative.
Yeah. Thank you for both of those stories. I love the Gandhi story, and also really appreciate your personal experience of becoming a monk and the inspiration that Radhanath Swami offered you. Yeah, and to reflect on this last point is like, we don't necessarily need to have given up the candy in the Gandhi story.
Yeah.
We would like to get there so that we can deliver an even more powerful message. But if we're able to maybe be on day 2 or day 3 of that story of like, I'm working on it, or at least I know that I eat too many sweets as well. And because I eat too many sweets, I actually know that it's bad for you. And so there's power from that authenticity, no matter where you're at in the journey. And that's really what we want to illuminate here through this framework is like, where does my own shame exist? Because of where do I see my own shame in relationship to the judgments that I'm feeling about other people, and what's really beneath that shame, and how can I start to walk through it?
This is vital. Yeah. We don't have to wait until we're at the highest standard of purity or integrity. What we have to do is be honest and be humble and authentic. And that's hard enough. Believe me, that's hard enough. And as we can see with what you've written and what we're speaking about, this stuff is not easy, but we have to start with where we're at and being a little humble. You know what? I'm also struggling with this. That increases the purity. That closes the gap. That's being real. That's actually not having now a gap. Of course, could we be purer and even more faultless? Of course. That's hopefully the trajectory. Hopefully we're motivated to go there as well. But it's at a certain pace, and it has to be gradual, step by step. And not everyone will make it as quickly to the goal. But always vital along the way is humility and honesty, being real. Yeah, I'm struggling. I'm also with you on this. I'm seeing this struggle that you're having, and I have it too.
Beautiful.
So, can you give us you mentioned in your piece some questions that really can help to anchor this teaching? what are those questions and how can we use those for our benefit?
Yeah, so to make this really practical, I offer three prompts or three questions that everyone can do right now. Maybe you want to pause the recording and you can do it right now or after you're done listening. So the first one is to think of, what is one thing that I am judgmental about? And you can think of this independent of this framework. So just think of one thing that you are judgmental about as it relates to others. And then the next question, which is really the key question: how is this also true about me? And notice in this question, it was very intentionally not, is this true about me? Our goal here is not to decide in a black or white way, is this true or not? The question is, how is this true about me? So there's an assumption there that there's at least some truth about how my judgment about somebody else is also true about me. And we want to look at those ways, whether it's the exact replication of the behavior or just a piece of it or the meaning that we're making about it. And then the last question is, in what way does knowing that it is true about me bring up shame? And this is really where we get to do some of the deeper work, where we understand what might we be ashamed about ourselves. And then the step after that would be, how can I start to walk through that shame, to really understand that shame and start to work through it.
Yeah, I found this so helpful, these three questions. What is one thing I'm judgmental of others about? How is this also true about me? And in what way does knowing that's true bring up shame in me? I think it really makes it a guided experience where you're not alone to have to decipher, well, how do I know what it is that I'm disliking? Or is it for real? Where do I begin with this? You follow this process and it will bring up stuff. It will bring up stuff. And maybe, as we've talked about, the second question, how is this also true about me, doesn't yield something so tangible. Because as we said, this is not applicable in 100% of cases, and certainly not one for one, apples to apples. But it doesn't hurt to ask, and it can be empowering to know that, you know what, if I've really fearlessly asked, if I've honestly and fearlessly asked myself, oh, that's good to know. Okay, so then maybe I can address this in a way that is constructive, and I've done my homework ahead of time. And if we're coming up with the answer to number two in every case being it's not true about me, then we know our ego has run the show. We have to start,
and if you
over.
might want to get a second opinion with somebody that you do trust. Maybe there's a best friend or a partner or a family member who you have that kind of relationship with, who you can just double check if you're coming up with no on that question.
Absolutely. More checks and balances. The more, the merrier. Very, very good. Yeah. So in closing, what would you offer as some final takeaways? I also I'm so enlivened by this subject, and it's brought up so much for me that I'm sort of buzzing here. Please, what would you share as some final takeaways?
Thank you. Actually, what's striking me right now to share is something that was not in the piece, but something that I've been thinking about a lot more recently, which is how when we have these experiences, we get a chance to see it as a learning experience, a teaching experience for us. And so if I think back on my time in the gym, there was disdain bordering on hatred. I don't know if that's too strong, but for these boys. And as soon as, like, now that I've gone through this experience and we're having this conversation here, and I've gotten a lot of gems about myself from looking at myself, because the boys held up a mirror. I mean, they were looking in the mirror, but they were holding up they're holding up a mirror to me right now as I'm thinking
Amazing.
about these things. And then what's the natural response after that? It's a feeling of gratitude that even without them consciously doing anything, and they didn't have my well wishes in mind at all when they were doing the thing that they were doing, but still it's like, oh man, these guys taught me something, and I can deeply appreciate that in a very sincere way. And so those feelings of disdain or resentment or embarrassment or shame or anything like that, they just naturally start to soften. And maybe next time I see them, I can smile and just feel more connected to them, even if there's never an interaction between them. And that's an opportunity and an invitation for every single person listening to start seeing these intense experiences, which might not feel so good, as teachers, and seeing what can I learn from this, and then the relationship with others and even myself can change because of that.
That's beautiful. So you're offering this opportunity to remove the judgment and remove the barriers between us so that we can really be freer, more humble, more connected to ourselves and each other.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really a beautiful vision and offering. And I was thinking about the thing that is at the heart of it, which came up earlier, envy. It's really all coming from envy. Why would I need to prop myself up? Why would I need to level other people? Why would I need to judge harshly for my own personal gain? It's really this envy. And I was reminded of a couple of things that carried a lot of weight that I just wanted to share with our audience here. This is a subject which actually Jesus speaks about a lot when he's talking about, like, let he who is without sin cast the first stone. That's what we're talking about. Or, pointing out the stick outside of you. Well, you've got a log in your own eye. In other words, what you're seeing outside of you is reflecting from what's inside of you. And we should first take stock of what's going on inside before we do anything. He doesn't say nobody should ever judge. What he says is, how sinless are you? Are you really in that place to be on a high horse? So let's come down to earth. Let's come down to reality. And then you can really love from that place. You can't love otherwise. And there's a song that I found extremely brutally confronting, in the way that probably some people reading your piece or even listening to this discussion might feel confronted. It's called Amara. It's written in Bengali by a great saint in the Bhakti tradition. And one of the great saints, who is actually his son, recommends listening or singing even this one song, Amar Jivan, every single day as a practice. Because the whole thing is about my envy and trying to pull other people down to make myself feel better about myself. And it seems like, why would I subject myself to that? Why? That just sounds masochistic. Or I can't even relate to it. There's one line in particular that I dislike in you, what you dislike in me, kept making me go back to, which is, when other people are happy, I feel distressed. And when other people are distressed, I feel happy. And I was like, oh, I like when people are happy. And I like, I want to raise people up when they're distressed. But deep, deep down, if we're very honest with ourselves, when people are feeling like they're struggling, or when we can say, hey, they're not so good, we feel better about ourselves for the reason we're talking about. And that's the raising ourselves up. So the practice is seeing that, getting so real and honest with ourselves, addressing the envy in us, and beginning to uproot it more and more and more. And that is something worth praying for. That is really something worth praying for and working on diligently and getting support for, asking other people, as you mentioned, hey, how am I doing here? Can you help me with this? I'm struggling with this. So I'm just really, really inspired by the prospect that you're offering us and the fact that it's so deep and on the same wavelength as some of the greatest personalities who've ever lived, what they were trying to teach us about going straight for the self. So I really thank you, Michael.
Thank
Is
you,
there
Hari.
anything
I
else
want to
that
just
you
thank
wanted to
you
share?
for, I mean, the wisdom that you have, and the gravitas which you help to anchor some of the teachings from this piece. It's incredible. Thank you for holding this discussion as you have, for guiding it, and for offering myself and the listeners such a deep well of what you understand and what you've discovered about yourself.
You're too kind. I'm all just about what you've written and your own insights and experiences. And I tell you, you are leading the way in just this practice we talk about at Upbuild of calling yourself out, calling ourselves out. You are such an exemplar once again of that. And it's very touching. So I'm just riding off of your inspiration.
Well, thank you for this conversation, and to everyone for joining us today.
Thank you so much. Thanks to everyone.